Welcome to Blackstone Book Talks, a podcast featuring exclusive interviews from Blackstone's bookish network of authors, narrators, and special guests.
Welcome to Overcoming Loss Through Literature, our latest Blackstone Book Talks panel. My name is Bella Bedoya, and I'm honored to commemorate today's annual observance of National Grief Awareness Day with an insightful panel led by Blackstone authors Rachael Cerrotti, author of the August 2021 release We Share the Same Sky, and Nora Zelevansky, author of the May 2021 release Competitive Grieving. Initially released as the first ever narrative podcast based on a Holocaust survivor's testimony, We Share the Same Sky is a memoir of memory and migration by award-winning author, educator, and documentary storyteller Rachael Cerrotti. Recently bringing in her paperback format launch on August 16th, the title has been praised as a gripping and deeply moving debut by Publishers Weekly and was named a winner of the 2022 Maine Literary Award for Best Memoir. Selected as a top pick of best new books by Entertainment Weekly, USA Today, Pop Sugar, and Woman.com, the Hoopla Book Club selection Competitive Grieving by Nora Zelevansky has been deemed a thoughtful reflection on loss by Parade Magazine and recently rang in its paperback format launch on August 2nd. So welcome, Nora. Welcome, Rachael. I'm so glad to have you guys here. Thank you so much. Congratulations to you on both of your recent paperback format launches, your one-year anniversaries. I'm such a huge fan of your stories and your approach to storytelling, how you navigate, your experiences into a source of inspiration and hope for others. And I really can't wait to hear you guys get into it. I'm going to kick off this roundtable now with our first question and let you take it away from here. So Nora and Rachael, today is National Grief Awareness Day, and I wanted to touch on a work in the year of magical thinking. The author Joan Didion wrote, "Grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it." Would you echo this statement, and how would you echo it in relation to your works?
Well, thank you so much for having us. I'm really looking forward to talking to Rachael. We just met today. I have many questions, and I'm excited to get to connect on somebody else who ended up writing about grief, which I know for me was somewhat unexpected. So I guess to speak to that quote, I would echo it. I would agree that as much as you try to envision what grief might feel like, it's never quite as you would picture. There are facets to it that you would not necessarily anticipate. And that's actually a lot of what competitive grieving is about, sort of the elements of the grieving process that are maybe a little bit less acknowledged. The challenge of navigating someone else's relationships in life once they're gone, and the desire everyone has to feel seen and have their relationship with that person sort of confirmed when the only person who can really confirm it is no longer there. So, Rachael, what do you think?
Yeah. And thank you, Nora. It's really nice to meet you here in this space, in this conversation. I know it probably sounds a little funny to people who haven't gone through a serious grieving, experience in their life. But there's such a beautiful way to connect with people through grief. And certainly, I listened to your book as well as, had the version. So I really got to just sit with it as this very audio experience. And I feel like even though you and I are just meeting today, I feel like I kind of know you through what you wrote about. And I think it's one of the things that people don't know about grief. And so you have a lot of pain, and it certainly is something that you do not know until you're there. And I think that every death is also really, really different. So after you've gone through one significant death in your life, you kind of think you're prepared for the next one. And then it sort of shocks you all over again that you're like, wow, this is a completely different experience, and it accumulates and you get practiced, but you also get thrown back into being, feeling like you've never gone through it before. But then there's also this space of deep connection where relationships change and relationships grow. And I think that's one of the unexpected places of grief. And Nora, you certainly saw that in your book through these characters that, I write nonfiction. And then to read your fiction, I felt like you were able to go to some spaces with grief that I think are harder to go through in nonfiction. That's one of my questions that I had for you, of just the freedom of what it must felt like, or perhaps that's an assumption on my part, was there freedom in writing through some of the unexpected places of grief through fictional characters?
Yeah.
So I'm curious your experience with that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I would actually like pose the reverse to you. But yeah, I think competitive grieving was inspired by real life events and a personal loss of mine, and it's not the same. It's not the story of losing my friend, because I made a really conscious effort not to have it be that, but it just touches on sort of my experience in the aftermath of his loss. And I do think that there's, in writing about grief in fiction, there is a kind of flexibility. There's a chance for a kind of wish fulfillment. In competitive grieving, for example, there's the letters that the character sort of writes to him, or the messages that she's sort of like sending to him, even after he's gone. And just the idea that there might be a way to get a response to that in real life, like most likely wouldn't happen, but there's a sense of like, well, for me, actually, specifically, like when I was sort of going through my grieving process, I have small children. It didn't allow me the same kind of space to like work through all that stuff. And in writing about fiction, and in fiction, I was able to sort of create a character who didn't have those barriers and sort of could focus entirely on going through that process. But yeah, I was wondering the same thing about you in the reverse. Well, one thing I was really interested in was that this idea that your grandmother like openly talked about her experience, because I know that often with Holocaust survivors, they don't, and there's a kind of giant silence, that permeates. And so I'm interested in just like that idea, like that she talked about it, like, were you aware of this your whole life? And then having known some of those stories for so long, like how do you separate the storytelling from the history?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I always grew up knowing that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and you're totally right in the fact that a lot of people don't talk about it. And a lot of the work that I do now in storytelling that's not my own story is with other people's family history. And you see this really big difference I'm very interested in like next generation stories. And you see this really big difference in how grief is passed down based off of whether people are open with their story or not. And everyone has their right to choose to talk or not to talk. So it's not a right or wrong thing. It's just will be experienced very differently by next generations if you choose to pass down stories. But when I started working on this project about my grandmother, I mean, I was 20 years old and I really wanted to be a photographer. And I was more so motivated by this desire to be like a journalist at that time. And so I had this very gung-ho backpacker, young person spirit. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until my husband passed away that I realized it was a story about grief. Like I never, ever would have labeled it as such until I went through something myself and had this opening up. And I remember, I write about this a little bit in the book, but I remember when he died and I was in the hospital, like just that night, it was like this coming to for me of being like, oh, wow, I've spent all these years. At that point, it was like 7 years. I was like, well, I've spent all these years digging into my grandmother's story, trekking around the world, moving in with strangers, doing all this work. And I never thought about grief. It was just, and I really had to have this like, many months of moments with myself of being like, am I really bad at my job? Like, did I completely mess this up? Like, what is wrong with me? And then I was like, no, that just was not an accessible space for me. So it almost goes back to that Joan Didion quote of just like, it was not a space that was available until it became known. And then suddenly all these other spaces opened up and all these other ways of seeing the story and all the other ways of understanding and interpreting my grandmother's experience. And so in some ways, like my major loss brought me a lot closer to understanding kind of the more core human experience that I didn't even know I was seeking to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it becomes complicated, because you're like, I don't want to have this closeness. I don't want to have this understanding because it means I have to go through this incredible loss. But at the same time, I'm really grateful for this like new way of understanding the world. And I still really grapple with that. It's hard.
It's interesting, this idea of like, almost like receiving information when you're prepared to handle it, or when you're in a place where you actually can process it. I was just thinking about your description, this of traveling around and staying with all these different people and being sort of like open enough to just sort of explore. And there's a kind of like fearlessness in that, which feels really connected to being like in your 20s to me.
Totally.
And like just I think about that sometimes, like just the idea that you would just like be like, oh, I guess I'll sleep on this person's floor tonight, so it's almost like, sounds like you sort of like had these experiences and processed the information at the pace at which you was possible, for you in terms of like your personal development.
Absolutely. And I always say to people, like, I mean, this book was like a culmination of, 10, 12-ish years of work. And there's no way I could go do that now. Like, I don't have, my spirit is different. It's adventurous in new ways that do not include, being nomadic for a number of years and like having no home. Like, I really value like my home and my bed and all those things in a way I didn't care about in my 20s, to your point. But also, I don't think I could have done it had I known what I was going into. And I think that's also the other thing about grief, is that like, if you try to prepare yourself for these losses, like, it's too overwhelming. But there's something about just like the day-to-day that makes it like you take it in like bite-sized pieces, because it really does shift and change. Like, and you see that in your characters too. Like, even just, I mean, don't get me wrong, but it's like a couple weeks that your book holds. It's not the long trajectory. And even in those couple weeks, you like, and that's really what it feels like. It does. It's like every day just feels like, and it's not linear. It's, it's a huge up and down.
Yeah. And time is bendy, right? Like, which is something we all kind of understand from the last couple of years of the pandemic, right? Time changes meaning depending on it's, what your experience is. So yeah, competitive grieving is only a few weeks, and yet it like feels to the main character and I guess some of the others as if like, well, there's been this giant shift, as if it has like the impact of a much larger amount of time. And I mean, actually, I was also thinking, I have another nonfiction versus fiction question, because even though my book is fiction, I was worried because of the sort of the personal experience as the jumping off point, that people I knew might read it and think that characters were them and be offended in various ways. And I know because I have a background like in nonfiction and journalism, that at times I've been worried about the way that I'm portraying somebody, and I've been concerned about this idea of not letting that kind of hamper the way I'm writing. So what I'm wondering for you is, was that a challenge for you? Did you have moments where you thought like, oh, I need to censor this or not? And, how do you take so many years of really research and work and make it feel like a narrative story? So yeah.
I don't know. I want to have some like really deep, like methodical answer to that question, because I get asked it a lot. And it's just one of those things, like, I think that, it was like, I think years and years and years of rewriting. I mean, I had written a manuscript about my grandmother's story before my husband died. I mean, it wasn't a good manuscript, but it was a manuscript. And after he passed away, it was like, the story just completely changed. And I felt like I needed to go do more research. I needed to travel. I needed to take my time. And like, so, I mean, maybe like certain sentences were pulled from that original manuscript, or certain ideas, but it became a whole new story. And I mean, even then was rewriting, and even after, the book was acquired and then going through the drafting. And like, I remember my dad, who's also a writer, would be like, you know, you're rewriting it again, like you're crazy. And I was like, but I, you know, there was something that was like incredibly therapeutic about it. Like it needed to be done. And, you know, it also needed to be done. When it was done, I needed to, you know, and even I think there was something very cathartic about knowing that the paperback came out recently, because it was kind of like the last stop along the way. And I know that like I'm doing lots of other things with this story, and I teach it, and I have this whole visual, you know, component to it as well, and audio. But I think that particularly with matters of the heart, you know, the good, the sad, the beautiful, and the ugly, like there comes a time where like you go through the therapy of creating something out of it, and then you go through the therapy of like letting it go. And so I think that part of getting it to where it was like me processing and me working through it. And it's funny, like since then, like I've gone through other losses, and I've gone through other like milestones of good things and bad things. And I used to write everything constantly. Like I would take notes on everything. And I suddenly have this like allergy to writing about my life, you know, and I feel a little guilty about it. I'm like, oh, I should be journaling. And then part of me is like, no, there's like, it's also okay to not document what's going on.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense after so many years of documenting things and actually using those, not just for your own sort of like personal development, but for to write an actual book and content. Also, we like live in a world that's so much about documenting things all the time. So it makes sense. But I will say actually, just because it made me laugh when you said, I don't know how I put together all of this and made it into a narrative book. And I'm also a fan of like writing a quick, messy first draft and then going in a billion times, because I just find that like way less stressful. But a question that I've been asked a lot, which I'm sure you have too, which I'm actually sort of curious about, is like people will say, well, how did you write this book? Like, how long did it take you? And did you have like certain rituals and whatever? And it's so weird, but I have no memory of writing this book. I really don't. Like, I mean, snippets here and there, but like, I kind of have no idea. And I think I attribute that in part to the fact that it was during a grieving process that I was working on it. And I'm interested to hear you talk about the catharsis, because people often ask me if it was cathartic, and I think it was, but I don't 100% remember. But it sounds like for you, it definitely was, that you like got it out sort of in stages.
Yeah, no, it was 100% therapy. Like, absolutely. It was totally, and I, you know, opposite of you, I like very much remember writing it. And it might be why I've like been having I write for audio now, so I've been doing a different type of writing, but it was like really, it was really good to get it out. But once I was done, I felt like I was done with it. And it's like funny to go back to some of my notes, you know, because I feel like I have, you know, the manuscript, and the book isn't that long. It's like a fairly short book, but then my Word document of everything cut from the book is like, kid you not, like 3 times as long as the book itself. And sometimes I go back to it, and I think it's really interesting, like how much I forget, you know, like things that I had the hardest time taking out because they were so personal to me. But, you know, they just, you know, as you know, the thing that I submitted, you know, it just maybe stopped the story, or just, you know, was stronger once I removed it, you know, that it was so painful to take it out because it was so important to me. And now it's like, I forgot that it even happened to me. And as someone really interested in memory, I think there's also something about like when we document, when we write things down. And I imagine this, you know, even though I don't write fiction, I imagine there's some essence in this for fiction as well, as like it's an act of memorializing. Like when my husband died, his mother said to me that like, you know, that they grew up in Europe, he grew up in Europe, and they would take those like post-communist Europe, and they would take him around the countries, and he would look at these like big statues around these different European countries. And he would always say, you know, Mom, like, what do I have to do to get a statue? Like, what do I have to do? And I was like, you know, what like 5-year-old kid is concerned with having a statue of them? And so for years, as I was writing the book and, trying to shop it around and trying to figure out how was I going to get this thing published, I kept saying, like, this is his statue. And it was a way for me to think about what I could do for him, what I could do for my grandmother. And it was very interesting because when the book came out and in the years since, like, for publishing a memoir when I was like in my early 30s, the majority of people aren't alive. And that's a very strange, I think, very unusual circumstance. And as people pass away, continue to, I just think that, like, oh, this is like my little way of, even if I'm the only one who ever read it, this is my way of offering a bit of a statue. So I'm thinking,
No, go ahead, finish.
I was just thinking when I was reading your book, because I have friends who write fiction, and I'm always a little jealous of fiction writers because it's something that I like want to do at some point, and I've always thought about like what would be. I haven't figured out like what's my way in with it yet, but I was curious. Like, I mean, clearly that was written from personal experience, because I don't think you understand that level of grief without having gone through something that was very clear to me. But I was curious, like, for you, like, I know that you said that you were worried that maybe friends of yours thought that perhaps they were composite characters in some way, but what was that relationship for you in terms of, were these completely fictionalized characters, or were there elements of different people, and was like, what went into deciding who these characters would be and how they would relate to this death that happened in your book?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you just said, I'm just like, yeah, like the first of all, just for, I guess, anyone who's listening who might not sort of know the process as well, or maybe like newer to writing in certain ways, that document that I think most writers keep while they're writing, that's like the cut from document, is like so important, because it does allow you to cut things and not feel like you're actually letting them go. And I feel like it's such an important part of the process. And it's such an interesting thing to think about reading over the cut from document now. I kind of want to do that now that you just said that. And then in terms of the statue, which is such a beautiful metaphor, I love it so much. I also felt like this book, I felt really, really grateful to have been able to create something that, even though it wasn't my friend's story, was, I felt like a way to honor him. So I feel the same way about this book as in that way you do, just that it was an opportunity to memorialize. And also my friend happened to be like really, really funny. And so I sort of wrote about grief through the lens of humor, and that felt like it was in relationship to him. In terms of coming up with the characters, yeah, I mean, there's pieces of conversations, there's qualities I stole from people. I have one close friend who is like a really loud talker, and I made one of the characters like a really loud talker, and then I was so worried she was going to be like, but it was okay. So yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything. It's about observing the way people behave, and then especially in those like intense situations where things are so like exponentially large. The way that people react, and just sort of trying to mirror that so that the reader kind of understands what that experience is, Rachel, I don't know, just because I think I have access to the comments more easily because I know you're on your phone.
Yeah.
There's a question for you from Jesse. It says, you retraced your grandmother's story in such a profound way. Do you hope to have your personal story retold?
So this is an interesting question for me. Thank you for reading it. I saw it come on my phone, but it was a little more awkward for me to find. Perfect. Well, it was interesting because when I wouldn't call myself a journalist now. I do documentary work, but that might not be the label I would use. But when I started this project, I was 20 years old, and I was just really dedicated to be a photojournalist. That was my end all be all at that time. And, you don't really go into that type of storytelling trying to be at the center of your own story. Normally, for folks of the camera, we like to be on the other side of it. And it wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years into this work where after I'd gone and traveled for a year, and, this was before my husband passed away, and I started doing public speaking and going into classrooms. And I started to realize that I was getting more questions about my experience than I was about the details of my grandmother's story. Mm-hmm. And that's only increased over the years. And I think it says something that I think is particularly true in American culture. And I don't experience it as much in Europe, and that's a whole other conversation. But I think there's this yearning right now to know where we come from and who came before us and how did we get to America, because so many of us come from immigrant families in recent generations. And so it, in a way, it became more about me, in a sense. I never intended to write a memoir. I remember when I really wanted to write a book to begin with, I was like, I'm gonna write a travel book and it's going to the travel section. And that was and then, when it started to get more serious, I had a few people tell me this isn't a travel book, this is something different. And I was and it was a little bit of a tension for me because I didn't quite feel comfortable being at the center of it. And so, that's still a practice for me to be okay. But I found that actually one of the reasons I've become increasingly comfortable with it is that when I talk about myself and when I share, my experiences or my feelings or my intentions with all this work, I tend to get somebody else's personal story in response. And so it was this thing that you're kind of trained not to do in journalism, is talk about yourself or have your own opinions in there. But then you realize the more vulnerable you are with your own experiences, the more access you have to other people's story. And when I say access, it's connection.
Yeah.
And, when my husband passed away, he died at 28 years old from a heart attack, total statistical anomaly. And nobody could point me to somebody else of that age who died in such a manner. And it just, rabbis, other, theologians, people who were community leaders, and then suddenly, I started working on widowhood stories. And now it's I constantly hear stories, maybe not at that exact thing, but something, relatable. And it's just a matter of people being comfortable talking about it. And I do think, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm aware of it, and I'm curious your feelings too after writing this book, but I know that people are very comfortable talking to me about death, and it comes up a lot. But I also think Americans are getting more comfortable with it in general. So,
yeah.
But, yeah.
No, I think so too. And I think it's such a good thing that it's becoming less taboo in all of those ways. And, one of the great, it's so interesting to talk to you because, I've done a lot of book talks, as I'm sure you have, and I've even done ones with other people who have talked about sort of grief in different ways, but not quite to this extent. And just so much of your experience, despite your book being a memoir and mine being a novel, just feels mirrored in mine. So, one of the great gifts of writing about grief has been people sharing their stories in a way that hasn't happened with other books that I've written. And I find that to be, it's touching, and I'm honored that people are willing to share their stories with me.
Does it get too much for you ever? I'm curious, do you ever feel you get, I know it's a tough question, particularly in this conversation, but I'm curious if you ever get sort of tired of talking about grief.
Yeah, what happens for me is I feel which is something I know that also people talk about a lot with grief, but is that I feel sometimes my grief isn't enough to be somebody talking about grief. It's I lost my oldest friend, but I didn't lose my husband. It feels sometimes to me do I have a right to talk about this? But I think the answer to that really is that we all do, if it's contributing in a positive way to a conversation that needs to be happening, and so I can only point to, my own experience. But I do, any way that I can be part of contributing to making it a comfortable topic, something people feel they can be open about, something people can be open about past the point of the funeral, where for some reason our culture acts you're supposed to be done being sad. It feels it feels valuable in that way. So there's a question from Nathan. This one's for me. Did writing about this experience in a fiction-based format change any perceptions you previously had about handling loss? Yes, I would say I actually didn't have, just being totally honest, I didn't have that much empathy for the people who I felt had behaved poorly in the aftermath of this loss. And when I wrote the initial draft of the book, I think it was my agent read it and pointed that out to me, that it wasn't really there wasn't like enough of an arc for the characters who were sort of being judged by the main character. And so in trying to sort of rethink that and sort of back up and see things from another perspective, I actually think I gained a lot of empathy. Because I think, sort of as I was saying earlier on, like somebody said to me, and I can never remember who it was, and I wish I could because it made such a big difference to me. But somebody said to me, everybody just wants to be seen. You know, like everyone wants just to feel seen, to feel like acknowledged, like their sadness and their loss is valid, you know? And that's something that I didn't come to until I had really written and rewritten the book. And then had a moment of like, okay, maybe people aren't behaving as I would have them behave. And maybe I didn't either. That's another thing. But, you know, but there.
Nora, how long was it that you started writing the book after your friend passed away?
Well, so he died in like spring of 2017, and I started writing it. I may have started as early as like late summer, early fall. Pretty soon afterward, I mean, I was having like a frustrated conversation with one of our mutual best friends, and I said to him, it's like competitive grieving, you know, and then I was like, I'm going to write a book called Competitive Grieving. And we sort of laughed. And then I was like, no, I think I'm really actually going to write a book called Competitive Grieving. Which is kind of interesting because, you know, it's usually, it's not the title that comes first. But actually, I was curious about your title as well, because I think it's really beautiful. And I was just wondering like, how that evolved.
I'm going to give a little hint to the title, and then I'll encourage folks who might not have read it because it's explained in the book. But it's not at all what people think. It does not come from my grandmother, and it comes more from my husband's death. But those words were said to me by someone really important to me in the aftermath of my husband's death. And that's my encouragement for people to go listen. And if you haven't read the book, but you haven't listened to the podcast, you can hear the voice itself on the podcast. But I remember, because, you know, this book is not just about grief, and not just, you know, it's really a refugee story in many ways, and in all the ways, along with other things. And I felt like when those words, "we share the same sky," were said to me, even though they were said to me in the context of grief and interpersonal relationships, I really felt like they just summed up everything that I was talking about in the book, which is, you know, the story really is rooted in my grandmother being sent from home when she's 14 years old, when the Nazis, you know, occupied Czechoslovakia, and her parents sent her away, and therefore she becomes the only survivor in her family. And the book, you know, goes all the way through history to the current refugee crisis, at least as it was in 2015, 2016, not with Ukraine, and, you know, and other refugee crises that have happened since. But I just felt like "we share the same sky" was like resonant for grief. It was resonant for families who are separated, whether because of war or just the global nature of our society. And so those words were said to me, and it was like, boom, I was like, that's the name of the book. Like, it wasn't even like, I didn't even like skip a beat. And I'd been doing the project for a bunch of years, and it was by another name, and, you know, whatever. But it's interesting because those words have, like, people have really taken to those words. And you know, there's something really, it's been a really beautiful experience for me, but they're not mine, and they didn't come from me. They've just been adopted by. Yeah.
The refugee thing is really interesting to me because maybe I might be sort of getting off topic a little, but just really quickly. Recently was talking to somebody, I was actually editing a project also about the Holocaust, and she also was talking about sort of the refugee culture and like becoming almost like a nomadic culture in all these ways. And it was interesting to me because as a Jewish person, I hadn't really heard people talk about Jews as refugees. And I was wondering if that was something that is that just me, or is that something that people don't always recognize?
Yeah, I think it's one of kind of the, even when we learn history and even in the way we talk about each other, like we're all storytelling about each other. And I think that speaking in contemporary day, and this is a broad statement that we could absolutely find examples that perhaps, don't support what I'm about to say. But I think broadly what I have found is that, oftentimes people do not associate Jewish stories with refugee stories. But part of that is when the Holocaust happened, the word refugee was not as much a part of our lexicon as it is now.
Right.
But it's 100% refugees. Like that's absolutely what it is. But somehow they've, just the way we've called it has been something different. But I think that's changing quite a bit. I grew up always associating the word refugee with my family history. But yeah, it's a really interesting conversation to think about, that where people come from, what culture they come from, we categorize them differently.
Yeah.
But I think that talking about grief, being a refugee is 100% part of the grief story. Whether I'm working with survivors, because I do a lot of work with survivors, not just of the Holocaust, but I do a lot of work with genocide survivors in general. And you're talking about grieving in so many different ways. It is so completely different. And, earlier you had mentioned, that maybe you felt like in some way you don't have a right to talk about grief, which I totally do not think is true, but I fully understand that feeling, because even after Sergio died, my husband, I was working on genocide story and a refugee story. And I was like, what right do I have to talk about my loss? Like, this was like one person who died, total natural circumstance. There was no fault of anybody. Like, this was a circle of life, just a life too soon. And like, what right did I have to talk about this? What right did I have to be sad? And you hear that a lot from children of survivors, of just like, what right do I have to my own pain? And I think this is part of the grief story also. It's not like, it doesn't end at the funeral. It gets passed from one generation to the next, and it frames everything. Like it changes the narrative of everything. And I actually think it would be really helpful if we started looking at these stories of refugees, not through a political lens, which we often do, but through a grief lens, because they leave their homes and they leave their families and they lose everything. And, these survivors taught me about grief, and it's just a completely different loss.
And yeah, and that goes to what you brought up about connectivity, right? Like it's much easier to connect with what it might, or imagine what it might be like to lose everything that you know and care about. When it's not sort of politicized in certain ways, it's just like the experience of being human. And I think it's interesting because you alluded to the fact that you work in all these different mediums, and that you've sort of processed this story through the lens of all these different mediums. And I was curious about that too, like the writing versus like documenting in other ways, if like how you move between those two and how they're different.
Yeah, well, like so I made the podcast first, the narrative podcast by the same name, also called We Share the Same Sky. And it was a complete and total accident. Like I sort of, I came from the world of photography, and I always knew I wanted to write a book. And I kind of like just somehow stumbled into the world of, audio storytelling with this story. And I worked on it for like, all of 2019 essentially, and it came out that fall. And having not come from that world, it was the best way for me to tell the story. And it was sitting with audio was the first time I started dreaming of the story. It was the first time I started having nightmares of the story. And I think that, earlier you asked about how did I pull this all together in writing the book? And I don't think the book would be anything of what it is. I don't think I would be nearly as proud of it as I am if I hadn't had to do the podcast first, because podcast writing is really different. And you get to use music, and I get to use people's voices. And I sat with interviews for hours and hours and hours and cut the tape and listened and got the essence of these people in a way that I don't know would have happened if it was just in written form. Because it was having these personal conversations with them over and over again, and a lot of them who had passed away at that point. So there was something that was really deep, because I think that especially when you work on a project for this long and you kind of black out a little bit of some of it, because your own memory can, deceive you, or you start to remember things differently. And so when it came to writing the book, I think I was much clearer on why I was even writing it after doing the podcast. And now I do primarily audio storytelling on my day-to-day, and I work with other people's family histories. And I don't think I'd be nearly as capable of doing that if I didn't spend all this time with my own. So there's I don't know, it's been great that one has really aided the other.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because you must have been so intimately acquainted also with all the material, having gone through it in this one way, that it would be difficult to piece something together if you didn't have it cataloged in your head in a certain way.
Totally.
In terms of piecing it together and puzzling the story together.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think there's also something of because my grandmother left behind so much stuff, and I had these diaries from early parts of her life into the later part of her life, you really develop this extreme empathy. I don't, maybe the better word would be compassion. I don't know. It's somewhere in between the two of what it means to just live a full life, and how I would see her contradict herself all the time. And I would see her because, it's somebody's diary. So it's a strange responsibility to go into somebody's diaries, because, you're not really supposed to be there. And then you're oh, I'm going to publish some of this. And watching her not be the best version of herself and grapple with that, and how to deal with love, and how her own story changed, and the reflection she had. And I think that that was a huge gift in terms of working with other people's stories, because you just realize that we're all just really just trying to figure it out. Way up to our 85th year, which is how old she got to live to, and you start to realize that none of us really know what we're doing, especially when it comes to difficult emotions like grief, where you're some days you do it really, really well with a lot of class, and other days you break down at the silliest little things. That's my tendency with grief, is I'm really, really stoic, except for when something really stupid happens, and then I just lose it. So, it looks different for everybody in those ways. It's not, it's not crying at a funeral normally. Yeah.
I think that's that notion of people being dimensional, of your grandmother leaving all that material, including her own diary, so that you could understand her in a different way than you actually knew her, than a different way than she presented to you as your grandmother. I think that's a really interesting idea to explore with regard to loss also. And definitely something that came up a lot for me in competitive grieving, just the idea that there are so many different versions of the people we know and of each of us. And there's the versions we present to the world in different ways to different people, groups of people. And it doesn't mean that the versions of anybody's version of you is wrong. It just means that they're different. And in order to write something like you did, or something like I did, there has to be an understanding of that idea of dimension.
Totally. And I love the way your characters at the end, because had, I made my own predictions in my head of what wouldn't happen, as we all do when we read.
Yeah.
And I thought it was like towards the end when all these like characters that you said that like, and that you mentioned earlier that you maybe had to develop some empathy for as you wrote, like came out, like it felt like, it felt like really real. I was like, yeah, like we just don't know where people's motivations are coming from, and we don't know where people's sensitivities are coming from.
Yeah.
And we don't know, like, we just don't know, and we assume a lot and we project a lot. And I think it's like, that's where I found it. I just found it to be, I found it to be really real, where I was like, yeah, like you need those reminders also. Like, it's why we read stories too. It's like, we need to practice for how to like, give people in our day-to-day life that too, of like, oh, maybe they're like, this is not to do with your book, but I always think like after Sergio died, I'm like, oh, maybe someone's like snapping at me at the grocery store, or like being a little bit rude because they're going through something really deep. Because I did that to people for sure. Like I had low patience and low tolerance, and
yeah,
it's hard. You just don't know.
No, it's a really good thing to keep in mind. And also because everybody, you don't know what's going on with people, and everybody has their own process for working through things. And actually, I was just thinking, like, I've always been a really, really terrible journaler. Like, I'm like, oh, I journaled for 2 days, and then 2 years went by. Like, I'm really bad about it. And I know you said that lately, like, you're just really not feeling like going there. You feel like you went there a lot, and now you're sort of backing off of it. But do you have other sort of rituals or coping mechanisms for working through when the grief comes back up, or or when you suffer another loss, and you're trying to work through that?
I think that I've come to like journal in my phone a lot in like fragments of sentences. And I think I have a similar pattern as you do these days, like where I'm like, if I like go back to my journals over the past few years, it's like a few pages here, a few pages there. And I just kind of like sometimes want to rip them out. I've resisted so far, but it likely will happen at some point. And I was having that conversation with my mom today of like, sometimes you don't want to go back to your own thoughts. Like, and I found myself more so, I think, wanting to forget things, not in a bad way, but just to make space for other things. Like, I think that I've been, I work with really heavy topics for work, not just my own story. And I think that I've been in a new phase of life, and probably because the book came out, I've been in this new phase of life of like seeking out a lot of like joy, and not spending so much time in trying to sort through the difficult, the meanings that come out of difficult times. And I've been on this other motivation to have this other motivation these days. And like, you need to make space for that. Like, like our bandwidth it has limits, and I've been trying to like figure out how to create more space for other things. And I think that like not being so diligent about documenting has been a helpful process for me that way. And I've been the same way with photography. Like I used to photograph everything. Like this project we share the same sky project has like over 100,000 photographs in my archive. Like it's just too much. And like, I'm starting to work my way through them for some visual storytelling I'm working on. But I don't know, like I've been like wanting to be really present, and just like whatever I remember, and that's okay. And I've been trying to be like, that's okay too. Like there's no, like we don't have to document to, like we don't have to preserve. It's a thing we can do, but it's not something we have to do. And so I think I've been, I don't know, a little bit on it in a different path right now. And I think that's okay.
Yeah. I feel like it's like you have to wean yourself off of that, like that sort of that version of you, right? Like into a different, allow yourself to evolve into like the next stage.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're talking about joy, I mean, I think we should all do that. I mean, I wish that I was better at it. I think that it's been a difficult period of time for a lot of people, and there's been a lot of loss over the last few years. And there's no way, as we all know, that loss doesn't just disappear, but the pursuit of joy, the search for hope, even in those dark spaces, I think is sort of what keeps us going. And that's something that I think is interesting about about what you're writing about, what you're talking about connecting, how the grief brought you to meet all of these people and make all of these relationships that impacted your life in all of these really significant ways. And for me too, this idea that the process of grieving could sort of turn you into the next version of yourself. Like these are sort of hopeful things that come out of the dark spaces.
Totally. Do you feel like writing about your loss has been like a form of release for you? Like, do you feel like finishing the story or the book and do you feel like there was something that like allowed you to, I don't really want to say let go, because I don't really think that's possible, but like to just release some of it and be able to make space for others? Like, was it that type of experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I guess part of what's hard for me is because to decipher is because of the timing of everything and how close together it all was, that it's like, is it time that's allowing me to do that? Is it the process of the book, writing the book? I think it's probably both. But, in the immediate aftermath of losing someone, as you said, like for me, it wasn't crying at funerals. Similar to the main character in my book, like I really almost like couldn't emote. Like the minute I saw somebody else start crying, I just like dried up completely. Mm-hmm. But I would just waste hours and hours of my days like looking online at like interviews with my friend, because he had been a musician for a period of time, and there were like interviews with him, and looking at yearbooks and like just there was so much intensity to the way in which I was like remembering him. And once I wrote the book and sort of worked through those ideas, I felt it just became a less intense thing. As you said, like you don't totally let go, right? But you maybe don't wake up and have that be the first thing you think of after a while.
I always like there's like a graphic. I mean, there's a lot of great grief graphics out there, but one that always like sticks in my mind is like, if I can describe it correctly, but it was kind of like a drawing and there's like a bookshelf, and just after someone died, it's like a big black book that just says like grief, and that's it. And then like you see like, years later, you have the whole bookshelf is filled in and the book is still there, the same size, the same amount, but you have all this other stuff surrounding it. Yeah. And I feel like that's like, for me, has been like a really accurate description. It's like, it's totally still there. And sometimes that's like the book I have to pull off the shelf and spend all my time in and consumes me. But there are other days that like, it just stays there and doesn't get touched, and just always will be.
And I do wonder, I think about, and I mean, it sounds like, at least for right now, you're like, I'm going to take a minute, but like if I would write about grief again, like, I'm not sure if I would or not, like maybe it's something that would be a through line in everything now, because it's in me.
That was going to be a question for you.
I think, I wonder for you too. Oh, wait, there's a question. How can literature help those dealing with loss navigate a life that someone else left behind? And what advice do you have for someone who is transcribing personal loss into fiction or memoir?
Do you want to take on the fiction first, and then I'll try to speak to memoir?
Sure. I mean, I guess sort of speaking to what we were talking about earlier about how fiction allows for a certain amount of flexibility. So I guess for me, in reading about, above all, to be honest, with competitive grieving, like my greatest hope is that it makes people laugh and cry. And I think there's a catharsis in that, and those like emotions, or acts of emoting. So I think that literature in general helps you, because other people's stories allow you to like live out your experience with a little distance. Fiction, just like I said, it just allows more flexibility for that. So there is like, most of us, when we have, for instance, like a competitive grieving experience, there isn't really like a moment at which it all gets resolved. It's like we just live with it, and maybe the anger rises up sometimes and goes away, or whatever it is. But in fiction, it's like, it can be like a neat, little package, tied up with a bow. And I think that there's some comfort in that.
Yeah. And I think for memoir, particularly if you're working with like a family member's belongings that they left behind, I would say the number one thing is don't worry about what it's going to be at the end. I started this work with my grandmother as first just sitting down and talking with her with no intention whatsoever, just to spend time with her. And then it evolved into like a family history project, then evolved into a travel log, and then evolved into this and that. And I have to say, like, the thing I'm probably most grateful for is all the rejections I got along the way when I was trying to find like photojournalism grants or fellowships or, places to support the work financially, who, I got rejected, which is the nature of my job, with the nature of any creative arts fields. You stomach rejection really well, you learn to. But I think that had anybody supported the work in those earlier stages, it never would have become what it needed to become for both me and to be a good story for other people. And perhaps the most important thing of that process, even though it was frustrating as a young professional, was it needed to like have a life of its own. It needed to drift from one media to the other. I needed to have my own personal experience with it without worrying about what the outcome would be. And I think that had I tried to package it too early, I would have lost the point of why I was doing it. And so that's like my number one thing that would be my advice, is just dive in without worrying about what it's going to become at the end of it, and then sort it through a little bit later.
I feel like that's really good advice in general when you're writing, that like when you try too hard to write something really specific, it's not really when you do your best work, that to let it evolve in those ways is like, it just allows you more room to breathe and for whatever you're working on to become the thing, that it could potentially become, with the kind of like depth and richness that you're talking about. And I think, like, how do you connect with people via story? It's like, I think it's like the authenticity of it is the most important piece, right? And in order to do that, you have to be willing to tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, I think sometimes. And so I guess that's a piece of advice I might give as well, which is just like, sort of speaking to not worrying about what it's going to be, but not worrying about, being too honest or being too authentic in terms of what you're communicating. You can always take away, as you know, you've got, 100,000 photos.
And then they could become something else. Yeah. And I think it's kind of the beautiful thing about writing is that, like, just because it doesn't get published doesn't mean that you didn't write it. And I have to remind myself that a lot too, because I've written a lot of essays that like I would have hoped to have gone somewhere. And, you get a little disappointed when you like don't find a home, or you lose your steam in finding them a home. Yeah. And then you realize, wow, just like the writing of it was a really important process. And like, there are things I've gone back to that I wrote like 8 years ago that were like notes in a phone, or just some, whatever, something that I jotted down that I happened to keep, that suddenly come back and mean something really different. And I think particularly with grief, that's cool. It's really cool because you get to see how much like your process changed. Like after Sergio died, the first thing that I did was I signed up for a writing course for grievers, like the next day or two, like 2 days later. And like in this course, it was like every day I got a prompt. And then there was like a Facebook group that I went into. It was called Writing Your Grief. And it was like, I swear it saved my life, because just every day, and I go back, it's been, but I go back to it for the book. And then when I go back to it again, sometimes I don't even recognize myself. And that's even an important process. So.
And how did you even know I'm just so impressed that you had the wherewithal to do that. Like, a friend of mine, it's amazing. A friend of mine lost her father 2 weeks ago, and she immediately did all these like so super evolved thing. Like she signed up for therapy and like a grief support group, and then she like downloaded meditations for grief, and like I was like, this is all so healthy.
Yeah, it was, I mean, part of it, I didn't have kids and I never stayed in my apartment again. Like my whole life evaporated was the best way I could call it. And so I had space, first of all. But I think with that, a friend of mine listened to a podcast and learned about it and told me. And even in that group that I joined, because it was like, you know, sections of groups of people who would start the month at the same time, people were like, oh my God, you're a few days out and you're like 27 years old. Like, what are you doing here? Yeah. But I swear when people ask me like how I survived those early days, particularly because like I suddenly had nowhere to live, no person, everything just disappeared. Like, I don't know what I would have done without those daily prompts. Now, I don't think you could pay me to try to answer them, which is funny, right? Like, I just feel like it would be too hard now. Like at that point, it was really healthy for me. And now I think it would be really too painful for me for someone to ask me to go back there. Like, I don't want to go back there.
Did you have a community of people from that as well? Or was it mostly the prompts?
There was a community there too. Like we all had a private Facebook group and we would share and then people would comment, and it was actually really helpful. You were taught how to comment. So, and that was a really important process for me also as a writer and just as someone who does storytelling with other people's stories. Of you were never supposed to like comment your feelings on someone else's feelings, but you could copy their sentence and repost it. So you could like echo what they were saying, but that as a writer was actually, and as an educator was a really important process for me to learn how to respond to other people's grief. Because I think that's the hardest thing for most of us, because we can talk about grief as our personal experience, but then talking about grief and how to support someone grieving is like, I mean, that we all should be taking classes on that in college, you know, instead of like, you know, whatever. But I think that was one of the most helpful things that got out of that too, was being with other people. Yeah.
Especially, I was just thinking it's just like another way in which the story that you were telling created, and your experience created connection, you know.
Totally. And then after that, I joined an online community called the Hot Young Widows Club. And that was really helpful too. That gave me like a good identity. I was like, yeah.
And then you're like not alone. Also, you're among people who are like who can relate to you. As you said, like there aren't that many people. There's another question for you.
Okay.
From Kathy. Did your grandmother write details of the wording and conversations in her journals, or did she tell you of what transpired and you formed the words to relay them?
Combination. So the way that the whole project started was I started some storytelling sessions with my grandmother, which were incredibly informal, no serious professional anything. I mean, this was before, like, I'm not that old. It was like before smartphones. Like, you know, I think I had like one of those like flip phones with a keypad. So I wasn't like, you weren't automatically recording everything the way that we do now. And it was just, I just wanted to spend some time with her. And then that lasted for about a year until she passed away. And then after that, she left behind an incredible wealth of information, diaries, photo albums. So I started going through, I digitized everything. I retyped her diaries I for like 4 years. But then she also left behind testimonies with various organizations, particularly USC Shoah Foundation that I work with now, has a huge archive of Holocaust survivor testimonies, and she was in there. And so it was really this, and then I started interviewing other people and having my own experiences. So it was really pulling from like a huge amount of material that was left behind, both firsthand to me as well as to other people.
Did your family have any feelings about you, like dealing with all the materials and working on this, or were they like, did they feel really positive about it? Did they have questions about it, or?
Luckily, I've been really lucky. I mean, I never had a single person ask me to change their name in the book. I never had a family member try to like challenge my interest. And I will say though, that probably for the majority of the time, people in my family didn't really understand what I was doing, because I didn't fully understand what I was doing either, like in terms of verbalizing it. And, you know, it's like, you're supposed to have like, when you work on these types of projects, just to have like an elevator pitch where it's like, oh, this is what I'm doing, and give it in like 2 sentences. Like I couldn't do that. Like it wasn't really until the book was done or the podcast was done that I was like, oh, this is what I did. And I think my family had a similar response of like, oh, this is what she did. And now it's clear in retrospect. But I've been really, really lucky because I know a lot of people where that's not the case. And I've been really lucky by the other people in the story, including my husband's family, who just completely let me have the story in the way that I felt like I needed to have it.
Yeah.
And that I know that there's a lot of things unique about my ability to do this, from the amount of information that was left behind to the freedom that I had in pursuing it the way I wanted to. Yeah.
I like, even in writing this story, and like, I don't know if this comes from like my background in journalism or what exactly it is, but there are just a couple of moments in the book where I took language like from my actual friend, or things that actually happened, or like the eulogy I wrote for him that sort of got integrated into it. And there's something I really appreciate about sort of that mixture of like, you're talking about using your grandmother's like actual language, and then your sort of translation of that, and combining them in this way that feels like a complete story.
I'm totally inspired by when I was listening to the book. I was like really inspired because there were so many things that were covered so well by you in Competitive Grieving, about like even like things that I didn't go into in my book, but I totally had experiences with, like going through people's stuff. And, it's such a complicated, like these are really complicated processes that everyone does really differently, and people feel different, but then I was thinking a lot when I was listening to it of like, what do I want to write about in fiction? Because there is a different freedom and different, and I always thought it would be like really fun to daydream in fiction of like, what had they not died, perhaps what experiences would have come. And that's like the way I think that maybe I could like, give myself some, not freedom's not the right word, but just some, I don't know. Maybe that's my way in. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, because I don't know, I guess I always, like I said, I was mostly a journalist, and then I randomly decided to try to write fiction, and I really didn't even know if I would be able to do it. So I really recommend just giving it a shot.
Do you like it? Like what's been your experience going, like, and are you writing? I'm also curious if you're going back to nonfiction, or if you feel like you're sticking with fiction for a while.
Well, I really was motivated to do it in part because at the time I was writing for newspapers and magazines, and I was just feeling a little bit like constrained by having to like shift my voice to match whatever the publication was.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of, I guess I was just feeling like I wanted to just see what would come. And so that's why I tried to do it. I had even in high school, like when I was like, the editor of my literary magazine, and I wrote personal essays. I never wrote fiction. Mm-hmm. But there is like what you're talking about, like a chance to write yourself into a place you want to live. Obviously not everybody does that, because a lot of people write about things that, places and things that you wouldn't find would be a dark place to go to. But for me, it feels like a chance to transport yourself even during the process of writing. I mean, and hopefully ultimately transport the person reading too, but, a chance to put yourself where you want to be. And so if that means like bringing people back to life, like that's something you can do. And so that's what I love so much about fiction. And yeah, I feel like I've totally been bitten by the fiction bug. And I actually am doing similarly and dissimilarly. A big part of my work is also as a collaborator on nonfiction books. So I have like a nonfiction book that came out like a month ago or so.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
What's the title of it?
It's called, it's called Roll, Red, Roll. And and it's rape, power, and football in the American heartland.
Oh.
So different topically,
Yeah.
but I do love the nonfiction, but it's interesting that now the nonfiction work has become more of like me helping other people or a shared voice versus my own nonfiction work. So I guess at this point, it feels like my work, like the work that's really mine, feels like the fiction. But yeah, I love them both. And I just feel like so lucky to have the opportunity to do that for a living, at least some portion of the time. You know, and to get to, like I said, like even just with writing Competitive Grieving, it just seemed like such a gift to be able to create something and put it out into the world.
Yeah.
And feel like you had created the statue.
Yeah.
Too.
Right. It's good. It's good. I think about it all the time. It's good. Part of me, you know, this is behind the scenes for everybody watching, but like part of me is like, oh, I really want to talk to you before we had this talk. But I think that sometimes with these types of topics, there's something that's like so nice about the first conversation about all of this, but particularly after like, you know, reading the story that you wrote, reading Competitive Grieving, it's like, it's so nice to meet the person behind the book, you know, and it's like, there's something just like, that's really like, it's just really cool. So it's really.
I feel the same way. And I also just want to say that, like, I think it's so important that you wrote this book, which I'm sure a lot of people have said to you, but especially with like the times we're living in and the fact that we're getting to this point where the survivors are no longer around, it's so important that you're like carrying these stories on, you know, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the lucky one here, honestly. So it's been wonderful to watch you both in discussion. And, you know, Rachael and Nora, I want to thank you for so thoughtfully leading this panel, you know, especially on such a sensitive event as National Grief Awareness Day. I know this can be a sensitive day for some people. And you both, you know, spoke so eloquently, so personally about your novels. And I feel like it really gave not just readers, but, you know, new people to our channel, just a better sense of what work you're doing and what it took to get to this point. You know, navigating loss is certainly an ever expansive topic. And I just appreciate your individual perspectives on how you turn pain into personal transformation and ultimately how readers and anyone can find the light at the end of the tunnel, because that's the most important thing. And we may have our own process with grief, but it is those crossover moments that drive the message that we're never alone in our universal struggle. And your novels certainly speak to that. Thank you guys again for joining, and thank you all for watching. I can't wait to see you all at the next roundtable.
Thanks for listening to Blackstone Book Talks with Blackstone Publishing. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest bookish news from Blackstone, you can follow us on Instagram at Blackstone Publishing, on Twitter and Facebook at Blackstone Audio, or on our website at blackstonepublishing.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.